How King Uzziah died. In the year King Uzziah departed this life, Judah felt an unsettling void. Understand that this wasn't merely a historical record, but the end of a prosperous reign, stained by pride, which left a leader isolated until his end. Uzziah's death symbolized the transition from an era of apparent stability to a period of uncertainty and new challenges for the nation. The earthly throne lay vacant, and what seemed secure crumbled. It is precisely in this scenario of human fragility that divine sovereignty manifests, inviting you to contemplate unshakable truth. Like and subscribe for more profound reflections. In the vast tapestry of divine providence, Uzziah's absence from Judah's throne was not merely a political event, but a vacuum that cried out for a greater presence. The nation, accustomed to the solidity of a reign that spanned decades, though tainted by arrogance and culminating in leprosy and isolation, now found itself facing uncertainty. You realize that the mourning and instability following the king's death were, in fact, a providential backdrop. Amidst earthly disarray, when human structures seem to crumble, the veil between the natural and the supernatural thins, allowing God's glory to be revealed more powerfully. It was precisely in this year of transition and apprehension that the prophet Isaiah would be granted a transformative vision, an experience that would shape not only his ministry, but the very understanding of faith for future generations. Imagine yourself then, transported to that crucial moment. This is not a simple narration, but an invitation for your soul to stand alongside Isaiah within the temple and witness what transcends common human perception. There, where the shadow of a king's death still lingered over the land, the empty earthly throne was confronted by the majesty of an eternally occupied celestial throne. You would see the Lord seated, high and exalted, his glory so intense that his robes completely filled the temple. There was no room for doubt or human glory there. Only divine sovereignty filled every crevice, every pillar, every corner of that sacred place. Above him, the seraphim hovered, celestial creatures with 6 wings. With 2, they covered their faces in reverence and humility before the face of God. With 2 others, they covered their feet as a sign of holiness and purity. And with the remaining 2, they flew, in constant readiness to serve. Their voice, unison and powerful, echoed through the halls, causing the doorposts to shake and filling the place with smoke. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. You would hear the unceasing cry, the worship that never stops, and would be enveloped by the truth that God's holiness is not merely an attribute, but the essence that defines him and sets him apart from all that is earthly and imperfect. Before such a manifestation of purity and power, your own fragility and the inherent sinfulness of humanity would become overwhelmingly clear. Like Isaiah, you would feel the weight of imperfection. It is not possible to contemplate God's glory without recognizing one's own condition. The natural response, that which springs from a heart confronted by divine holiness, is deep humility, the confession of one's own impurity. Isaiah's words would become yours. Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. This is the reaction of a soul that perceives the abyssal distance between God's holiness and the stain of human sin. But the vision does not end in condemnation. Divine grace precedes the call. One of the seraphim then flew to Isaiah, carrying in his hand a live coal that had been taken from the altar with tongues. The coal, burning and purifying, touched the prophet's lips, and the seraph's voice declared, "Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin atoned for." You would feel the pain of purification, but also the liberating joy of forgiveness. It was a symbolic act, yet one of profound spiritual truth. Purification by fire, preparing the vessel for the work that would follow. The impurity was removed, the conscience cleansed, the soul ready for the Master's voice. And then, amidst the purified glory, you would hear the Lord's own voice asking, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" This question was not a sign of divine doubt, but an invitation, a search for a willing, purified, and surrendered heart. It would resonate not only in the temple, but in your own spirit, calling you to consider your own response. And like Isaiah, propelled by the vision and by grace, you would witness the ready and courageous response, "Here am I, send me." A total surrender, without questioning the difficulty of the mission or the resistance that would come from human hearts. Isaiah accepted, even knowing the message would be arduous and that many would harden their hearts, sustained by the promise of a faithful remnant and the coming Messiah. The lesson that emerges from this experience is unshakable and extends through the centuries to you today. Human leaderships are flawed and transient. Earthly thrones may stand empty, kings may rise and fall, but God's celestial throne remains eternally occupied, high and exalted. Your trust should not reside in rulers, in human projects, or in the world's apparent stability, but in the unshakable sovereignty of the Creator, who governs history and fulfills His purposes, even in humanity's darkest years. It is when the earth seems to collapse that heaven opens, revealing the glory of a God who reigns supreme. It is He who calls, who purifies, and who empowers, inviting you to respond, "Here am I," amidst life's uncertainties. True stability is in Him, and it is to this truth that we are continually invited to turn our eyes, especially when the foundations of the earth seem to tremble. Like and subscribe for more profound reflections on God's unshakable sovereignty amidst life's transitions. That year, marked by the loss of Uzziah, was not just a hiatus in Judah's chronology, but a turning point, a crossroads for the nation and for the prophet Isaiah. You need to understand that this king's death was not an isolated event. It closed a complex chapter in Israel's history, a 52-year reign that, despite being prosperous and expansive, carried the seeds of its own ruin. Uzziah, whose name means "My strength is the Lord," began his journey on the throne with a heart turned toward God, seeking counsel from the prophets and prospering in all his military and civil endeavors. He fortified Jerusalem, developed agriculture, equipped the army with new technologies, and expanded Judah's borders. The nation flourished under his leadership. However, prosperity and power brought with them the insidious temptation of pride. The Bible tells us that when Uzziah became strong, his heart was lifted up to his own destruction. He overstepped the divinely established boundaries for his royal office, daring to enter the temple to burn incense on the altar, a prerogative exclusively for the Levitical priests, descendants of Aaron. You can imagine the scene, the king in all his earthly glory, defying sacred order, confronted by priests who tried to stop him. But Uzziah, in his arrogance, did not retreat. And right there, in the holy place, at his moment of greatest defiance of divine authority, leprosy broke out on his forehead. A visible and incurable stain, a sign of impurity that disqualified him from worship and governance. Leprosy was not merely a physical disease, it was a symbol of spiritual impurity and exclusion. The powerful king, the invincible military leader, the nation builder, was forced to live in isolation, set apart from his people, from the temple, and even from his own family.
His palace became a prison, and his throne a distant relic. Judah was governed by his son Jotham as regent, while the leprous king awaited his end, dishonored and isolated. This was the figure of the human leader who, even with a promising start and notable gifts, succumbed to the intrinsic flaw of human nature, to the vanity and pride that oppose God's holiness. When, finally, in the year King Uzziah died, the nation was not just losing a monarch, it was losing the last illusion of perfect, self-sufficient leadership. The vacuum on Judah's throne was a reflection of the spiritual emptiness that the king's own failure had exposed. Earthly structures, however imposing they seemed, were fragile and susceptible to corruption.
Uzziah's death, therefore, was not merely a chronological marker, but a watershed moment that, in its darkness, allowed a light of incomparable revelation to break forth. It is in this context of disillusionment, of an earthly throne marred by disease and pride, that Isaiah's vision gains an even deeper dimension. Uzziah's impurity and isolation contrast dramatically with the majesty and holiness of the Lord whom Isaiah saw. There was no stain, no leprosy, no pride on the celestial throne. There, holiness was perfect, glory was full, and sovereignty unquestionable. The earthly king's failure underscored the perfection of the heavenly king. Uzziah's inability to govern, due to his condition, highlighted God's eternal capacity to reign over everything and everyone. For you, this passage serves as a powerful reminder that genuine faith is not built upon charismatic leaders, stable governments, or periods of material prosperity. These are transient Uzziahs who can ascend in glory and fall in dishonor. The true anchor of the soul, especially in times of uncertainty and crisis, is the immutable reality of a God who does not fail, who does not become corrupt, and whose throne is never empty. He is the King who needs no counselors to burn incense in his name, for he himself is the source of all holiness and worship. This contrast between Uzziah's fall and the ascent of Isaiah's vision challenges us to realign our expectations and our trust. Where have you placed your security? In human structures that sooner or later will reveal their cracks and imperfections? Or in the Lord of hosts, whose reign is eternal and whose glory fills the whole earth? Uzziah's death opened Isaiah's eyes to a greater reality, and the story continues to open yours. Amidst the fragility of earthly powers, we are called to lift our eyes and behold the King who is always seated, high and exalted. Embrace this truth and allow it to transform the way you see the challenges and uncertainties of the world around you. In the next reflection, we will delve deeper into how Isaiah's response to the divine call, even in the face of the harsh reality of an unpopular message, shapes our own commitment to God's truth. The death of Uzziah, this earthly king whose glories were overshadowed by pride and disease, was the prelude to a time when you would be invited to turn your gaze from the fragile thrones of humanity and fix it on an incomparable majesty. It is in this void of earthly leadership that Isaiah has the vision that transcends any crisis, any disillusionment. You need to imagine the scene. As the dust of the royal transition settled in Jerusalem, the prophet, in spirit, was led to the true center of power. He did not see a king on his deathbed or an insecure regent. He saw the Lord. Imagine yourself there, alongside Isaiah, inside the temple, but not a temple of stone. It is a vision of the celestial temple, where the veil is torn and divine glory is revealed in its overwhelming fullness. Your spiritual eyes would behold the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, rising above all that is earthly. No disease, no pride, no leprosy could defile that throne. And the train of the Lord's robe, vast and radiant, filled the temple, filling every space, every shadow, with His light and holiness. It was not just a majestic figure, but the very presence that overflowed, dominated, and defined the place.
Around the throne, you would see the celestial figures, the seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2, they covered their faces, a gesture of reverence before the unfathomable holiness of God. With 2, they covered their feet, in humility, perhaps because they were not even worthy to look upon the ground the Creator treads. And with the other 2, they flew, in ceaseless worship and service. Their voice, unison and powerful, echoed through the temple, and you would feel throughout all creation. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. This is not a scene to be merely observed. It is a reality to be felt, and Isaiah felt it. You would feel it. Before such holiness and glory, human fragility, imperfection, the impurity of every thought and word become unbearably evident. The smoke filled the house, perhaps not only from the divine presence, but from the reverent dread that accompanies the revelation.
And it was then that Isaiah, a chosen man, a prophet of God, could do nothing but exclaim, in utter despair and contrition, "Woe is me, for I am lost, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Notice the depth of this confession. It is not a mere admission of generic sin, but a specific recognition of the impurity of the lips, the organ that utters words, that declares, that prophesies, but that also lies, slanders, and contaminates. Isaiah, who was meant to be the voice of God, felt utterly disqualified. You too, beholding perfect holiness, would be confronted with the undeniable truth of your own imperfections, your careless words, your hasty judgments, your impure thoughts. Isaiah's "Woe is me" is the cry of every human being who truly encounters God. But the story does not end in condemnation, for divine grace precedes the call and the mission. One of the seraphim, moved by a celestial command, flew towards Isaiah, not with the sword of justice, but with an instrument of purification. In his hand, you would see a live coal, taken directly from the altar, a symbol of sacrifice and divine atonement. With this incandescent coal, the seraph touched Isaiah's lips. A purifying pain, a consuming fire that paradoxically does not destroy but cleanses. And the word was proclaimed, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin atoned for." You can feel the relief, the transformation. The impurity that once condemned you is removed, not by your own merit, but by God's gracious intervention. It is a moment of redemption, of empowerment. Only after this complete purification, this restoration of spiritual dignity, is the voice of the Lord heard again, not in condemnation, but in a question that echoes through time, inviting participation in the divine work. Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? This question, for us, reveals the Trinitarian nature of God in counsel, seeking a volunteer, a messenger for a world in need. And Isaiah's response, immediate and unshakable, springs from that place of purification and grace. "Here am I, send me." There is no hesitation, no excuses, no weighing of the difficulty of the task. There is only total surrender and unconditional availability. Isaiah's acceptance was not ignorance of the challenges. He knew the message would be harsh, that hearts would harden and ears would close. God Himself would warn him about it. But the prophet, now purified and strengthened by the vision of the king, was ready to go regardless of the consequences. His trust was not in the receptivity of the people, but in the sovereignty of the God who sent him. For you, this is the essence of the Christian call. The vision of God's holiness must lead us to brokenness, to the confession of our impurity. The live coal of Christ's grace must purify us.
And the voice of the Lord asking, "Who will go?" must find in us the same readiness. "Here am I, send me." No matter how empty earthly thrones may seem, how flawed human leaderships prove to be, the celestial throne remains firm. And from that throne emanates glory, holiness, and the call for you to be an instrument in His hands, living a life of divine purpose. Do not seek your security in fleeting glories, but in the unshakable and eternal presence of the King. If this reflection has touched your heart and inspired your faith, please like this reflection and subscribe for more messages that deepen God's Word.